Hi, and welcome to the Red Tunic Podcast, a podcast where I look to rediscover what makes gaming fun and enjoyable by having positive conversations with those related to the industry. My name is Link, and today I'm joined by Roth Cardona, Technical Director at Vaporware Limited, and currently working on Beyond Sunset. Hi, Roth. How are you doing today?
Hello, I'm doing good. Yourself?
I'm doing all right. Thanks for asking. So, Roth, before we get started, just to make it a little easier for me and my guests, or sorry, make it easier for me and anyone listening to know who you are better, would you mind telling me a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. Roth Cardona, US-based independent game developer, currently working with Vaporware to make Beyond Sunset. Been doing that, 1-2 years, somewhere in that range now. But doing kind of casual game dev for, I guess, roughly a decade at this point, and I had not considered it on those terms until now, and I feel a little older than I did before.
I can definitely understand that. When you look back sometimes at how long you've been working at something or on something or what have you, and that realization of, oh crap, I'm old, or what have you, kind of sinks in, right?
Yeah, it's really wild. Occasionally I'll pop into like some online communities I haven't been super active in recently, and I'll say something, and I'll see somebody refer to me as one of the old timers, and I'm like, what do you mean? That's not true. There's plenty of people older than me, and I look at it, and it's the people who got into that before me. Only got in a couple years before, and it's been a lot more time since then. So comparatively, I'm in the same bracket as people that like I would consider like the really old guys, and it's wild.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. I can't say I'm exactly in the same boat in terms of what I'm doing, being the old person, seeing as I work with mainframes, so I'm relatively young.
Yeah.
But like when talking online in communities and such, and it's like just the realization that everyone is like in their, early 20s or whatever, and it's like, oh, you're a child. Thank you. I forgot how much older I was than you until like they refer to, I don't know, like the GameCube or the Wii as being like retro, and you're like, oh, okay, you're a child. Thank you. I forgot.
Yeah, the Daredevil movie, right? I was talking with somebody, and I made a reference to it, and they went, oh, that's an old movie. That came out before I was born, and it completely derailed the conversation.
Understandably so, right? Just understandably so. So, Roth, just, because you said you've been doing this for a couple years. No, quote unquote, finger quotes, sorry, a couple years, a little bit. Can you explain how you got into developing and making games?
So, I don't know when exactly this started, but it was before we had home internet, which is another thing that apparently dates me. Is not having home internet. But anyway, like my dad had in some cabinet in the computer room in the basement, like a bunch of old PC gamer CDs, right? And I had a Windows 95 computer, right? And it largely didn't run a whole lot. So like I was looking through there for demos to play of stuff I hadn't played already, and I found a bunch that had like custom Doom levels on it. And I talked with my dad about that, and he he got like a Deep Sea for me, which is an older Doom editor. And I went from there making stuff largely not knowing that there was like people online sharing any of that stuff, or using any like source ports or anything. Yeah, it wasn't until like partway through high school where I got like a computer with like internet on it that I found out about all that stuff. And that's probably where it really went off, because then it wasn't me effectively just kind of learning everything the hard way. I could actually look up the right way to do stuff. I could look up documentation instead of the whatever limited documentation Deep Sea came bundled with, right? And as it turns out, if you're developing something as complicated, or like even something, a whole game is complicated, but even just a single level is fairly complicated, and not having to brute force your way through every tiny aspect of that, made things so much easier to do. And if I go back and look at my like really old like pre-internet work versus the stuff from right after that, there was a huge leap in complexity.
So, sorry.
Oh, yeah, no, go ahead. I was going to say, so like just being able to talk with people about stuff, and to get help instead of trying to do everything on my own, massive boon.
So, I haven't really made maps with any kind of Doom level editor or anything like that. So my knowledge is very limited on the like restrictions or the limitations of it. However, I do believe one of them was the fact that you couldn't actually have like a let's say like a bridge with like a tunnel pathway through it. Now I imagined, trying to brute force your way through having multiple levels where you like go under the floor and everything. Like I imagine that was a headache trying to figure out why you couldn't brute force it. And then once you actually got some kind of documentation, or able to ask people, you probably realized just how much you were smashing your head against the wall for maybe something like that, or other actual issues that I'm not just maybe making up.
Oh no, absolutely. I did attempt to try and do like some 3D without really knowing exactly what was going on there, because I'd seen a bunch of like screenshots from Quake, but like my computer couldn't run it, and I was like, okay, well, I want to try, maybe I can make 3D work with this. Absolutely not. It does not work in the engine. It didn't work in any source ports for quite a while. And there are some, without getting too far into the weeds about specific tricks for Doom mapping, there's some stuff that I guess is technically a bug, but gets used as a feature where you can kind of visually fake 3D, but you can't go underneath anything, right? It just looks like you could maybe, right? And that one I would not have been able to brute force. How that works is really unintuitive if you're not familiar with it.
I completely, yeah, I can understand that, and I'm not familiar with it, so well, let me rephrase that. I'm even more unfamiliar with it, so such an explanation would probably be lost on me. However, Roth, I am curious, based on your experiences in, getting into making games, from what it sounds like, largely being around making Doom maps or such surrounding Doom. Do you have any words of wisdom that you could share based on the experiences that you went through, beyond get in access to the internet sooner?
Yeah, I think that get access to the internet sooner is advice that I think at this point has kind of taken care of itself, to be honest. But like the biggest thing for any sort of creative work is to make stuff where you enjoy the process of making it, and whether or not the result of that process is good doesn't matter, right? It's, do you like doing it? Are you having fun doing it, right? Once you can get to that point, well, okay, then you can care about making something that's good. But a lot of making good product, like good games, good levels, good art, anything like that, a lot of that is just being familiar with your tools and comfortable using them. And if you get hung up on the fact that your art sucks when you don't know how to use the tools, that's going to be really discouraging. But if you like using the tools, then it doesn't matter what the art looks like, right? If you're having fun putting paint on canvas, or if you're having fun drawing rooms and connecting them together in any sort of level editor, well, then that's all that really matters. If you get really comfortable with that, you can start pushing the actual end product. It's what about what about the fun thing I'm doing could be improved, right? And working at it from that end, I feel like gets you a lot better, right? This is really similar to some advice about going to the gym I heard from somebody, which is that a thing you should do is, even if you don't want to like truly work out, you should still go to the gym, right? Just read a book, get used to going there, right? Because the important part isn't using any of the equipment, it's getting comfortable with what you're doing, right? And then once you're comfortable with it, then you can expand. And I think being aware that from the beginning that growth is going to happen, instead of getting frustrated that you're not already out of the gate making something good, it is something that you will kind of need to have in mind. Otherwise, you're going to get really discouraged.
So thank you for that advice. And, there was a few things in there that I think are really great. And, the main one being, it sounds more like, don't worry about the results when you're just trying to get let's say like the habit or like the muscle memory of doing, right? Like, in like a similar vein, if when it comes to like making a map, getting into the habit of just being able to quickly hammer out a few rooms, when you first start that, it's going to be difficult. And then, after like a few weeks or whatever, it's going to be like second nature. And once you are able to do the basic stuff, your growth will start and you can make more complex things. And, the more complex things you make, the more fun you can have doing it. And, then it turns from just learning how to kind of like putting paint on the canvas, dipping your brush in like blue and just being able to say, okay, now blue's there. Now you actually learn brush technique and how to do different things. And, all you do is grow from there, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And once you get to that point, then you can start learning how to do stuff on purpose, right? Specifically in game design, there's a kind of a balancing act you want to be doing between doing design on purpose and doing design by discovery, right? Like if I have a goal for what I want a particular game to be, right? You should be able to you want to be able to actually achieve that goal, at least somewhat, right? But also you don't want to get too blinded by the fact that the goals you're pursuing you don't want to get too blinded by that pursuit, there we go, to like miss good ideas that kind of arise by accident, right? And there's a huge balancing act there, right? And if you're used to early on doing basically everything by accident, right? And then messing around with that and seeing what works and what doesn't, I think you'll get a good feel for the sort of design by discovery. And I think that's a really, really useful skill, because if you accidentally make something good, oh yeah, if you can dial in on that and capitalize it, that is frequently way better than spending weeks trying to work on a very particular system you have in your head. Especially if the system you have in your head ends up not being fun, because sometimes that does happen, right? A lot of ideas are good as ideas, but in practice, they maybe need a ton of work, right? Whereas, generally speaking, I've found that if something is fun, if I discover some fun aspect of a system design or a level, man, that's fun right away. Like, that's how you found it, is you notice how fun it is. And so it's very efficient, especially on a small team, to be able to pull ideas like that out and go, okay, well, I know we didn't intend for this, but what if we develop on this idea further?
And yeah, I completely understand what you're saying there, and like that makes a lot of sense, because like sometimes, exactly, you said, it's just something that works. Maybe it's not working as intended, and it's fun. Maybe it's something you just tried to hammer out, or it was like a glitch, and that was just something that was amusing, and you're like, oh well, this is worth maybe exploring, or what have you. Like the one of my favorite glitches, I think, from Skyrim, was the giants being able to launch you into the stratosphere. And that was not, nowhere did anyone sit down and say, this is what we want to happen. But, as more people had that happening to them, and as funny as that was, they just said, screw it, let's leave that in there because, it's it's just fun to watch yourself get rocketed off into space, right? So like sometimes the unintended results are just the best things because they're just you enjoy them so much,
Skyrim is actually a really good example of that from something differently. So it's a quirk of the pathfinding in Skyrim that if you follow a fox long enough, it will eventually show you treasure. And that's not like on purpose. They didn't code any of that in intentionally, but it's a really neat feature, right? Effectively, it has to do with how the foxes tell if they're far away from you. And instead of doing an actual distance check, they count the number of, effectively, nav points between the player and them. And they try and put as many of those in between themselves and the player as possible. Right? And it's way easier to just count a handful of objects than it is to do math about how far away you are from something. So they do it that way to save, to make it more performant. But as a result, if you're out in like a big open area, there's not a lot of detail, so the points are kind of sparse. But if you're near, say, treasure, right? Well, there's more complicated geometry there, which means there's more node points. So if a fox ends up by one of those, they end up putting themselves, as far as they can see, farther away from the player. Which means that if you follow a fox, eventually they'll find a place like that and go, oh, if I go to the other side of that, I'll be really far away. And they lead you to treasure completely by accident, right? And that kind of stuff crops up all the time if you're looking for it.
So I didn't know about that for foxes in Skyrim, and that's actually really funny. And, another example of like, something that was unintended, but it's fun and it just works, right? Like sometimes, like they could have went out of their way to try and not let that happen. But the realization that it's fun, kind of like the rule of cool kind of thing. Like it's like, oh, screw it. It's fun. It's cool. Just leave it in there. There's no point because it's doing no harm and, people will enjoy it, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So Roth, I want to ask about this before we get too much further.
Mm-hmm.
Not because I'm worried we'll get derailed, just because I don't want to kind of miss the chance to talk about this one. For Beyond Sunset, it is a, I believe I read this, and I apologize if I am totally wrong, but it is based on some version or variant of GZDoom, correct?
That is correct. I think technically we're using a fork of GZDoom, but the only thing that does is it changes the icon to the Beyond Sunset logo. Other than that, everything else is stock GZDoom.
Awesome. So the reason I wanted to confirm that, just because the next question or two possibly are hinging on that, and it would be very bad or wrong of me to just ask these questions incorrectly. So like going back and speaking previously when we were speaking about, getting into making levels using the editor for Doom that I don't remember the name of, the one that you used, and like just the, because that would have been many years ago now. I'm wondering what, from your point of view, like the landscape, I guess you would say, in being able to edit and make levels and do stuff with the Doom engine, and like the emergence of more GZDoom based indie games getting more attention and being like releases and what have you. I'm just kind of wondering, how that's changed your approach to what you're doing with the engine. And like obviously, because you made a comment that now it seems like you can actually do stacked things, stacked levels, or I believe that's what you said. That's how I interpreted it. So more just wondering like how that's changed for you, and like just to talk more to that, and I apologize. That's a kind of a vague question that I'm throwing you towards, and I'm sorry.
No, that's not a problem at all. Largely speaking, a significant amount of the design that goes, at least from a level standpoint, honestly has not changed a huge amount. Like, there are room over room and 3D like capabilities now, but largely speaking, and this is the big strength of the engine, is most levels, if you wanted, you could fairly accurately recreate them, drawing like a top-down map on graph paper if you really wanted, right? Which makes it really easy to turn out like test levels, right? Or where we've got an idea for an encounter or something, and if it doesn't work, the rough block map for that did not take a huge amount of time, and it's really easy, if something's not working, to just scrap a whole section and start over as a result. Whereas with something with a lot higher fidelity that uses true 3D, where conceptualizing it from a top-down standpoint on paper doesn't super work very well, it's a lot of work if you find out that something isn't clicking, to have to scrap it and start over. Where occasionally for personal projects or in Sunset, if something isn't working, occasionally I'll save a backup, scrap the whole thing, and then start over on that section. And if that clicks, well, then there we go, right? And knowing when you should... knowing when you need to refine something to get it to work versus when you need to throw the whole thing out and start over, that's something that takes a bit of you gotta have a spider sense for that. There's not really a good delineator for when that is the right move versus the wrong move. I suppose one way to say that is if you cut out a big chunk of a project you're working on so that you can replace it. If you replace it before your boss notices, well, then you did it. Good job. That's a horrible metric. Please don't do that in production, right?
That's very fair. Like, even if you think you can be sneaky, don't do it, right?
Yeah,
like...
no, don't. That you can get away with that if you're doing like hobby projects, like, or just Doom modding, right? And I think this kind of flexibility and this sort of ability to take something that in another engine with more, or with tools with higher fidelity, would represent a significant time sink. Well, because it doesn't represent quite the same time sink, being able to more easily do large reworks for things, and the ease of use that the tool set has, I think is why a lot of people are using GZDoom for indie, like, boomer shooters. It's because largely, yeah, you can map whatever you're working on graph paper to do a sort of pen and paper approximation, like a paper prototyping phase. And if it seems like it'll work, go ahead and do a blockout. And you can make really significant progress very quickly. Once you get into the actual detailing and combat design, that gets a lot more involved. But in terms of getting something that is most of the way there from nothing, that's really easy. And it's really intuitive to do it, is, I think, the most important part. Cat, what are you messing with? I have no idea what he was messing with, but as soon as I said cat, he started walking away. So I think we're sorted for now. But yeah, I think the tool set being really easy to use is largely its greatest strength, right? And I think that makes it really attractive for indie devs, especially in boomer shooters, where the sort of lack of fidelity is part of the aesthetic you're going for anyway, right? Before boomer shooters sort of took off in the way they did, there were a handful of projects, indie projects, using GZDoom that were sort of aiming to replicate some of the, like, detail and fidelity and polish of a contemporary game. And so a lot of their appeal was, you wouldn't believe that this is using the Doom engine. And that's a bit of marketing, because it's not using the Doom engine, but, like, people know what Doom Engine is. With GZDoom, maybe not so much. Whereas now, a lot of games are coming out and they're just like, yeah, it's GZDoom, right? You know that. You can look at it and see that. There's no attempt to obfuscate what's going on under the hood. But that's considered a strength at this point, right? I've even seen a couple projects that run on Unity that have attempted to emulate some of the feel that GZDoom has out of the box, right? Because it does such a good job at nailing the feel of the kind of game we're making with it. And when Patrick, the lead dev for Beyond Sunset, was getting started with the whole project, he was like, okay, well, I have time now. I think this was at some point during quarantine. He's like, and I've always, people told me that Beyond Sunset, because it started out as a pen and paper, like tabletop RPG, apparently the balancing for it wasn't good, but all of the feedback he got was, I don't like this as an RPG, but it would be cool as a shooter. Well, when quarantine hit and he had a bunch of extra time, he was like, okay, well, I guess I'll try and make it into a shooter. I already know how to do like Doom modding, and there seems to be a lot of folks having good success with that, and it hits the aesthetic I would want to go for anyway. Let's just start with a tool that checks all the boxes instead of going with something like Unity, where you would have to do a bunch of work on top of that to try and coax it back into looking like a retro game.
And that makes perfect sense. I'm very much a fan of the approach of, if there's something that does what you want to do, there's no reason to like reinvent that wheel, right? And if the game feel that you want is Doom, and you already have the experience or what have you using something like GZDoom, it just makes perfect sense to not try and recreate the aesthetic, the feel, the everything elsewhere, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And especially for indie games where you have a limited team of people working on it. I know for some of the assets we've made for like the second episode or for the demo, had a really fast turnaround, right? And as a result, just like with the levels, if some of it isn't working or there's a change we want to make, for a game with a lot higher graphical fidelity, making changes like that would have constituted significant man hours to implement. Whereas occasionally somebody will throw out an idea and somebody will go, like during the meeting where we're discussing things, we'll go, I don't know, give me 5 minutes to test that. Which makes iterative design way easier when your iterations happen way faster.
Exactly. Yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. And yeah, like I think many people, especially those that are in development, can be envious of a setup where testing something is as simple as just spending 5 minutes to know if it's going to work, right? Otherwise, for some cases you spend like you said, if it was a much bigger engine that had a lot of other things, the compile time, the setting up, the implementing, the making the map, the whatever, the time sink necessary to test something, that can be a very hard loss. And in my own personal experience with non-game related programming, where I've tried testing things, you kind of get married to the idea because you end up with this lost time fallacy or whatever it is, the right statement. And, you kind of just be like, well, I've already spent 20 hours on this. I have to make it work. And then it takes you another like 30, 40 hours and you go, this was a horrible idea. And, you've wasted more time than you should have had you not just called it quits and looked at it from a different angle or accepted that you need to throw it out the door and go, right?
Oh, absolutely. That there is a corollary to this though, which is that there are certain parts of the engine that are not real, or that take a lot of work to make them modern, right? For for instance, classic Doom has honestly very stupid enemies, right? But for like the AI for them is really simple, which makes sense. It has to be performant on computers from the early 90s. But if you want to do something a bit more involved than that, and especially for a game like Beyond Sunset, where the player moves very quickly, well, that means the enemies, will have to respond to a lot of rapid movement from the player. And we found that the enemy AI design from the 90s that GZDoom has out of the box doesn't work. And what would work is a modern enemy AI system. However, something like that is very complicated, and so that ended up being one thing where, no, just implementing something like that from the ground up, there's no two ways about it, that just took a bunch of work, right? For Unity or Unreal or basically any modern commercial engine you can get, either they come with something like that out of the box, or there's an available add-on that just has reasonable pathfinding right there, and it integrates with all of your tools very well, and you don't really have to think about it so much, right? Except we had to think about it. So, depending on what you're trying to do, right, GZDoom does a lot of aesthetics and a lot of the level design. It lends itself very well to that. But if you want performant, like modern AI or modern UI, or there's all sorts of stuff that in a modern context is super easy to knock out, because either the work has already been done for you or the engine is kind of designed for that, like from the ground up, that you kind of can't avoid doing a ton of work to set that up yourself. And that was a huge stumbling block for us until we got that mostly working, right? There's a handful of additional features we can add on top of that, but no, as it turns out, AI is really difficult. Like, it's the hardest part of the game hasn't actually been making the content for the game. It's been making the enemies move around the levels in ways that don't feel like they're just kind of ping-ponging around randomly, right? But now that we've got that in there, everything feels so much better. So definitely a huge improvement, right? But that is a bit of a cautionary tale. Definitely look into what sort of behaviors you're going to need, not just the aesthetics that you're going to want from the game as far when you're looking into various engines. Because depending on what you have available for you that other people have made that you can license out or what have you, you might be in for an unforeseen amount of work.
You know, yes, that's a very fair statement, and I think that's another important piece of advice that people probably can and should take to heart. Now,
oh yeah,
sorry.
I was going to say, because it's something where if I had been making this game as the lead dev, I would have gotten to, we might need to use really complicated AI, and I'd have went, okay, so what we're going to do is switch to an engine that has that out of the box, because I'm not going to program that myself. Patrick, the lead dev, is a much better programmer than I am, though, and belted that out, all things considered, fairly quickly and incredibly performantly. Like, it's super impressive that we've managed to do that, and to my knowledge, I think we're the only indie game with GZDoom that's using something that robust. I know we did open source the system for doing it, so I think some folks have integrated that into their stuff as well. But, like, we're definitely the first people to have enemies that smart. They don't do a huge amount with it. They're not making tactical decisions, right? They're making quick decisions. That way the player can't corral them. But still, like, it is incredibly impressive, I think, that Patrick managed to pull that off.
And, you know, I think that's something to be aware of, that, you know, when, you know, because when the game comes out, or, you know, when trying the demo or what have you, you know, that you won't be able to corral them. That that there is some brains behind them to try and counter that on you, right?
Oh yeah, I keep flinging out ideas for making enemies that are really mean and use the fact that they can strategize to just be just a jerk to the player, because occasionally the players have had it too good for too long, I always say, and sometimes you just need to kill them. And that goes back to being able to do game design on purpose. Sometimes you do need to put pressure on the player in a way that isn't necessarily super super fun, and you need to be able to do that on purpose if you can. Now, largely we haven't done this to necessarily the extent that I'll throw out, because it is largely a joke. But a handful of enemies will do things like, because we can have enemies that shoot projectiles that intercept you, right? They'll lead their shots. We have some enemies that will just move in front of you. That way, if you're fighting a boss, for instance, you can't just circle strafe around it forever, because all of the little things in the arena will just block your path. Which in Sunset solves two problems, actually. One, it means you don't have to track down dudes so that you can sword them, and then they're a big loot pinata when you do that, right? You don't have to stop and track them down. They come to you. But it also prevents you from using a really simple strat to just cheese the boss, right? And it's always nice when you can get one set of easy to implement behavior that solves more than one problem. It's efficient design.
So Roth, following up from that, because we kind of, there was some leeways on this talking about other games, and I don't know if this question's going to be about those other games that might have drawn inspiration from or what have you, but and this very well also could just be Doom, because how you got started. I'm assuming at this point it probably is, but what was the game that absolutely made you go, oh, this is what I want my career to be? And what was it about that game, or maybe the main features about that game or what have you, that you enjoyed the most about it?
Ooh, definitely it would have been Doom. I mean, that's the only one growing up I had like this like computer that could make custom stuff for it. I think if I'd have had a nicer computer sooner, I would have probably gotten into Quake instead of Doom. Because a significant amount of what I was doing was seeing like screenshots for games my computer couldn't run, and being like, okay, well, I'll try and make something really cool with what I've got then, right? But to that effect, Quake, absolutely, right? Quake is something I did not play for the longest time because I was stuck on a potato that ran Windows 95. But then, funny enough, by the time I could afford a new computer, I skipped out on basically everything between Doom up to like Doom 3, because that's what I bought the new computer to play. And then, weirdly enough, never played Doom 3. I did play Quake 4, which uses the same engine. I had a good time playing Quake 4. I skipped a huge amount of games in the middle. So as far as influential games for me, there's a handful of like older games, and then a bunch of stuff roughly contemporary to like, well, Doom 3 and Quake 4. And then I didn't get a new computer until I moved out for college, and that's about now where I have, the ability to play modern games, right? So there is a weird conspicuous gap where like I just haven't played a bunch of stuff that you would maybe consider seminal works for boomer shooters or FPSs in general, because I skipped over that as with gaming hardware.
And that kind of, I should say I'm not surprised by that answer, only because you kind of already answered it earlier. I just wanted to get a full confirmation, because sometimes that's not the case. And something you did say that I don't know if you mentioned earlier or I just missed earlier was the fact that you would see games you wanted to play, and instead you would then try and recreate what you thought the levels that you were seeing were, to play a different version of that game, just like the maps. And I think that's kind of it's just funny, just that you had that kind of dedication to wanting to play the game and be like, oh yeah, no, I played the levels for that game, not the game, but I played the levels.
Well, look, we played the artist's interpretation, I suppose, of a kind of small screenshot on like the back of a PC Gamer's CD, right? Or something like that. I honestly, looking back on it, I have no idea how child me had that much dedication. At this point, I absolutely would not have been doing that, but like, it's not like I could have driven myself to a game store and I didn't have the internet, so I suppose it was just, well, what else was I gonna do?
That's fair enough.
I mean, I
Now,
did attempt to make some like pen and paper games too, because I was like, oh, D&D sounds fun, but I have absolutely no idea how to get like the actual game. So I just kind of made stuff up. Those were largely just me drawing cool like swords and stuff. There weren't any mechanics about it.
so it,
I
it
like
was more just picture books of swords
Well,
and stuff.
yeah, I knew D&D was a game about, well, Dungeons and Dragons and assorted paraphernalia in between. But I didn't have any idea what the mechanics. I knew nothing about it. I didn't know anybody who played it. So I just kind of got the closest approximation I guess child me could figure out. And I was like, this is definitely a game, but it's mostly just playing Calvin Ball.
Which, let's be honest, for anyone that's played D&D, sometimes it is just
Yeah.
Calvin Ball.
Oh, absolutely.
Uh, so I guess the better way to follow this question up then is, um, to not talk about the game that made you want to do this, but maybe, your favorite game, because, you've touched on how you had such a wide gap and you have some influences from some earlier stuff, but, everything kind of after that gap. So what's your favorite game then?
Ooh, that one is actually a point. That is a like a point and click game called Putt Putt Saves the Zoo, and this is probably coming out of left field if you haven't heard of that one, or even if you had, just based on stuff I've said already. That one is my favorite game for reasons unrelated to, I guess, influences, but that's one where there is a song in that one. There's a couple songs in it. When you get to the zoo, where they've got some like topiary animals at the front gates, and they sing a little song to you if you click on them. And when I was at a birthday party for a friend in college, like I was talking with a girl there, and I'm not sure how the Putt Putt Saves the Zoo came up, because that's like a children's game from the 90s. But we started singing that song, and there's a bridge in there where there's two different parts going simultaneously, and I knew one part and she knew the other. And she's actually downstairs right now. We've been together for like 11 years. We've been married for like 4. So like that one's my favorite game, because like that's definitely where it started, is that birthday party singing like the music from that game. I mean, it's also like a really fun game for, well, okay, it's a really fun game for that demographic, I suppose. I wouldn't really recommend it if you're like in your 30s. It's not super riveting, but no, it's a fun game. It's got a lot of charm. No, so that one's my favorite. Okay, right after that is Doom, though. Let's not get that one twisted.
So, thank you for sharing that, because that's an absolutely wonderful, wonderful story. And like, I can absolutely understand how and why that game would be your favorite at that point, right? Like a lot of, a lot of games that I think we kind of hold up as favorites. Sometimes it's a product of the time, product of who you were at the time, or what have you. Like maybe you just really liked Zelda, maybe you just really liked Doom, and like that's not speaking ill of your reasons for having a favorite game where it's because you put so much time into it and you enjoyed yourself, and it fundamentally led to your what you're doing now, or whatever. But like I absolutely love the idea of games being a favorite because of the in your case, I don't know if nostalgia is the right word because it was 11 years ago, but like the everything surrounding the game as to why that game like is so special to you. And like I think that sometimes we like we forget that the nostalgia of a game, or the nostalgia of it, and what it can lead to, can just be put us in such like uh, I hesitantly use the word weird, or maybe absurd, but it can put us in like some really absurd positions where you're having a conversation with someone about a game from your childhood and both you enjoyed it, but then the next thing you know, you are now singing a song from that game,
Yeah,
and then you're married, right? Like
yeah.
it's
That's a pretty good summary of events, I think.
I don't mean this in a negative way when I say it's absurd, but like from an outsider, yeah, absurd is definitely the wrong word, but like just the series of events are just awesome. Like they're legitimately can have you in awe just to be like, oh yeah, well, XYZ, 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 and then this, right? It's just, yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. Fundamentally, I'm just gonna go in circles, but thank you for sharing that story. It's a wonderful story, and it's a wonderful reason to look at that game and be like, no, this is my favorite game, and this is why. So thank you so much.
Yeah. And to pivot a little bit off of what you said about nostalgia for games that maybe haven't aged super well, I liked Redneck Rampage, and I am not afraid to say that one. I've only played the first episode of Rides Again because that's all that was on the CD my dad had. But no, I like that. That was fun. I don't know. I don't really have any follow up there. It definitely isn't a good game, right? It's not good, but like, I don't know. I had like 8 games at the time.
So, speaking of Redneck Rampage, and I know the popular discourse is to say it's a bad game. And look, I'm not going to argue it's a good game. It's been many years since I played it. Like you, I played it when I was younger. I only played that first episode, like it sat there. I don't even know if it came in a jewel case, but it sat there with like the demo disc that you had to buy from like Best Buy, or in my case from Future Shop, because I'm in Canada, and that's what we had before Best Buy came in and bought them and turned them to dust. Um, but like I with the stack with like the first episode of Blood, the first episode of Shadow Warrior, the first episode of well, no, not Duke. I had the full version of Duke, but either way, like it sat there on that stack, and like 8-year-old me, 7-year-old me, however old I was when I was left alone with a computer and you know those kind of games, I thought it was fine. Um, I I could tell it was janky, but I didn't think it was horrible. Um, I thought it was stupid and fun. I can say that. So, like,
Oh yeah,
yeah,
it
I'm
was
not
really
gonna.
good for deathmatch. Because we would do, well, not really LAN parties, because nobody brought their stuff. But yeah, occasionally when friends came over, we had all of the computers in the basement networked together, and yeah, deathmatch on that was really fun. I think we played more of that than we did deathmatch in Doom. Funny enough.
So yeah, exactly. Like I was saying, I'm not. Far be it from me to argue anyone saying they enjoyed Redneck Rampage, because I also enjoyed Redneck Rampage. I'm not gonna go back and try it again. I don't need to ruin what I thought of it, even though I know what I thought about it was probably wrong.
Oh yeah, and there's a handful of games from that era that like looking back, I'm like, oh okay, yeah, that one wasn't very good. Um, like because I didn't have any game consoles growing up, like the only kart racing game I played until like college when somebody had like Mario Kart 8 or whatever the Wii U had, um, was a game called Chicken Hunter License to Grill, which it was not good. The first time I played it with my wife, they managed to get stuck on a level, And I don't know how much I had played it growing up, and nobody had ever managed to do that. And they're like, "This is awful. Mario Kart is so much better." I was like, "Well, I don't know about that." No, it definitely was, right? Um, it was definitely a Mario Kart like knockoff. But like, no, it was an okay game at the very least. It's a perfectly cromulent game. We'll say that. Uh, Other games in the same sort of franchise, not so much. They I don't think they're as good, but that one's fine.
So, Roth, to step aside from Redneck Rampage, only because I I'm very terrified of what direction any more dwelling on that would cause us to go.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I do want to ask, outside of playing games, outside of making games, outside of gaming in general, what kind of things do you do? What kind of things do you enjoy? Hobbies, what have you? And if your life is just consumed by video games, that is also a perfectly valid question answer to the question. But at the same time, I do like to ask, outside of gaming, what do you do? What do you enjoy?
Okay, so we're gonna go in, I guess, reverse order here. So traditional art is something I've been doing. Like I've done a lot of. I've done a lot of like pen and ink drawing. I've been doing a lot of like little mini landscapes on because I bought like a 400 pack of blank playing cards for some reason years ago. I'm not really sure why I did that, but I've been drawing like little landscapes on them. As like I don't know. I've just been doing that with like Sharpie pens. Any kind of music that I can sing to, I will listen to. The range of genres that I will like actively like listen to and that I will look for like deep cuts in that genre is really wide. When I still worked in the office, I'd have coworkers notice that and they'd ask me for like music recommendations, and I'm like, you have to narrow it down. Otherwise, I can give you something that I'm pretty sure you won't like, right? I had a playlist I would give to people who wouldn't like narrow it down any that was specifically designed to have as much contrast song to song in them so that it was a hard tone shift but also a really big spread of genres and artists. To be like, okay, if you like things on this list, tell me which one of those it is and I can give you more recommendations for that. For basically anything that isn't house or noise music. And yeah, both of those are really good, but a significant chunk of my like non gaming hobby time is actually with mechanical keyboards of all things, which mostly vintage ones actually. So like buying older keyboards, cleaning and restoring them, tuning them up as needed, and then getting them working on modern computers. Which that started when I lived when I was still renting apartments before we had like a house. And I wanted to get into vintage computing, but all of that stuff takes up a lot of space. But every so often I would find like an older keyboard at a thrift store, and that doesn't take up space, and I can use it with the computer I already have, right? So it's not even taking up any more space than it would have. And so it was a good way to scratch the like vintage computing itch without taking up vintage computing space, right? Now I've definitely taken up a whole bunch of space with it. I can't make the argument that it's a more compact hobby at this point. But I'm not stuck in an apartment like moving around in college all the time either. So that's not as much of an impediment. But you could put a ton of hours into that. It's a huge rabbit hole. And I could spend like a good 6 hours straight talking about that and be like, all right, now we're into the beginnings of the intermediate stuff, right? We just finished the basics and we start the intermediate, so we're at 6 hours. There is a surprising amount of like history. I've read like 80s German technical documents about all sorts of stuff. As a result of this, I've like learned a reasonable amount about like navigating patent law. and like just looking up patents, which that one's just me. Most people I don't think do that part of it. But yeah, there's a ton of directions you could go. I've started getting into vintage calculators as a result. I don't even know how that happened. It's just, oh, there's like 4 or 5 that I can see from my desk. I've gotten into typewriters too. There's a ton of stuff you can do with that. And largely speaking, I figured out what I like in keyboards and what doesn't like make my hands hurt because I do have RSI. So like I've already figured out what works best for me and what's the most comfortable to use. Everything at this point is just kind of, well, I don't know. I think it's neat. Sometimes you just throw stuff in a pot of boiling water on the stove to see if it melts it. That's normal hobby stuff.
That's very fair and wildly fascinating because, before we started recording, before we were setting this up, Patrick, the lead for everything, made the comment that could be a rabbit hole or something the equivalent of basically buckle up. My response was, I'm scared in a good way, because you never know where those kind of things are going to go. And that's absolutely wild and fascinating because a lot of people like mechanical keyboards. And, I don't think, and I'm not trying to dismiss or talk down or what have you to anyone that likes mechanical keyboards. I have a penchant for, enjoying a mechanical keyboard, but I'm not really even into the enthusiast stage. So, most people, when they say they like mechanical keyboards, they're going to think, okay, you like the new ones, the 60%, the whatever, some of the absolute buck wild ones that you can see. I was not prepared for or expecting you to go into them being old mechanical keyboards and, pulling up German or any other language for the matter, like technical documentation to try and understand.
I did not learn German. I want to clear that one up. I did not learn German for this. Those are available in several different languages, which that's so you could be compliant with, like, as it ends up, Germany ends up setting a lot of standards for a handful of things in the EU. I think largely because they're the most particular about a handful of things. And this is an example of it, right? Where they set some guidelines and some standards for keyboards, among other things. And everybody in the European market goes, well, if we want to sell it in Germany, we'll just follow that, right? And, well, at that point, that's the European market that's got a standard, which means that, well, that's a third of the planet as far as a lot of manufacturers are concerned. So everybody just kind of goes, okay, we'll just adopt that as a standard, even though it's not like legally binding that we do that. So yeah, in the 80s, the early 80s, there's this big wave of like a bunch of like mechanical keyboard, like a bunch of keyboard stuff just gets redesigned to be compliant with that. And now there's not really any reason to do that. Right? Like it's not legally binding. Like you could do whatever you want realistically, but not everybody still roughly follows that guideline. It's also been superseded by entirely different standards that are basically just rephrasing the old ones as well.
And I imagine that makes a lot of sense because once the borders started opening, once you were able to like order something, even if it was going to take like 6 months to have it shipped because of, how that worked in the 90s or what have you. But I imagine as things, globalization happened, yeah, it made less and less sense to try and cater everything to, like you said, the, 1/3 of the market when you could do a little easier things and what have you. Now, what I am curious about is, though, because the chances I have to speak to anyone about vintage keyboards is incredibly low. So I can't even bring this up, especially because one, it shows my age, and two, it's a wild thing that, unless you're interested in it or you're my age, or in that bracket, it means nothing. So I am curious what your take on the old mechanical keyboards, and I think they primarily went with IBM's, that had the trackball for whatever reason stuck up right above the right hand numpad. Are you familiar with those? I expect you to
Oh,
be, but I'm gonna
yes.
ask.
I don't have any of those. Um, the okay, this could get into a big spiel about just how keyboard layout evolves over time, but like largely speaking, the reason you would have that near the numpad is because a lot of people's what a lot of the reason the numpad is on the keyboard at all is for spreadsheets, and being able to switch from numeric entry on the keypad to moving the mouse around without actually having to move your hand very far would have been super useful. Uh, those aren't really great on for modern computers, mostly because any analog input devices for computers are they're really low resolution if they're old ones, which makes sense. They have to match the resolution that's on the screen, right? You don't need super fine control when you've got like 80 columns of text on the screen, right? Um, so if you hook up like a trackball, because it's really easy to get those working on a modern computer, but if you hook one of those up now, like if you've got a 4K monitor, it takes a while to get your mouse to go from one side of the screen to the other. Uh, and they're, I don't know, they're neat, but they're not super practical. Having mouse buttons though on the keyboard for like the left and right mouse button, that one actually is really useful. Big fan of that. I think I normally do some shenanigans and make them be like copy and paste instead because I'm not using the trackball. So the advantage of having two extra keys that are kind of out of the way, well, it's nice to be able to copy and paste real easy.
That's very fair. So yeah, well, I was gonna ask your opinion on it, but I think that's you answered. And it sounds like potentially probably not really a place in today's market to reintroduce them.
Maybe. I think realistically though, if you were going to put a pointing device for controlling the mouse on a keyboard, trackpad's fine. I mean, that's what they use on laptops, right? It's as basically the best one that isn't a mouse. Especially if you get multi-touch, because then you can zoom and scroll and do more than just move the cursor around. And doing stuff like zooming with and other things like that with a trackball is a little less intuitive. But I don't know. I used one when I did some data entry work a couple years back, where for whatever reason, the tab indexing in the program we were using was weird. So if you hit tab, it wouldn't go to the next field. It would usually go to the previous field. But sometimes it would go just somewhere weird on the page instead. So being able to enter some numbers, hit tab, enter some numbers, hit tab, type something, well, you couldn't really do that because the tab wouldn't go in an intuitive place. So having a trackball on the keyboard was actually really handy because I had to move my hand between the numpad and the mouse all the time. And the fact that it doesn't move the mouse all that much or all that quickly didn't matter because I didn't need to go very far to click the next text box to enter stuff in. So they're definitely still useful in a modern context, but it's going to depend, I think, on your situation.
And that's very fair and a very I don't want to say diplomatic, a very logical viewpoint for it. So in the same vein of vintage mechanical keyboards, because like I said, rarely are you afforded the opportunity to talk to someone about such things. I'm gonna throw weird questions at you about it, time permitting or what have you. So, in this one, I know that this one could be a bit contentious. I think is the way that's pronounced. But in the comparison for the way that vintage mechanicals presented themselves versus the way that current ones are, what's your hot take on the design philosophies or what have you, between that.
Um, ooh, if you go early enough, in terms of like how stuff was marketed, mechanical essentially means it's contact based in terms of the how the actual switches work, which when everything was kit based in the 70s and you were kind of expected to buy all of the parts piecewise, knowing what kind of circuitry you would need to buy to go with the switches you bought was important. So mechanical versus, they have a really weird name for like early membrane stuff. It's like elastometric or something. There's a handful of things. So for that one, it doesn't mean anything special. It's just, here's how it works so that you know what kind of like chips and PCBs you need to buy to solder up to this and then connect it to your computer. I don't know why that mechanical is the one that stuck around the longest. But for older stuff, there's some quirks of the designs in terms of styling that I find really charming. For modern stuff, a lot of it's fine. I don't have a super hatred for it. Like I know a lot of folks sometimes do. I normally turn off like backlighting and RGB when I like have a board that uses it. Largely because I'm not looking at the board most of the time while I'm typing, and it's a bit distracting, personally. I've used one laptop that had backlighting. That one was actually useful if you were like using it in the dark, but generally speaking, you shouldn't be using you shouldn't be on your computer in the dark. You should turn a light on because it's bad for your eyes. But no, they're fine. Now, a lot of the marketing about like, oh, this Switch is good for gaming. No, it's not. That's not how that works. Most people, and this happens all the time when people are looking into buying a nicer keyboard. They're like, okay, well, what switches are good for gaming? And it's like, that's not the right question. The right question is how good at gaming are you? Because for most people, being bad at games is why you don't do good at games. It's not the keyboard, right? Like, if I'm playing a game and I die a whole bunch in it, it's because I'm bad at it, right? It's usually not the keyboard's fault. The only benefit you're gonna get from like a cheap $10 rubber dome keyboard versus a nicer mechanical one is you don't gotta hold the switches, like the keys, down all the way constantly, right? Because they actuate partway through. So if you lift up just a little bit on like W when you're moving in a game, if it's a cheap keyboard with just a cheap dome keyboard, lifting up a little bit, now you're not pressing it. But on a mechanical one, you lift up a little bit, it's fine, right? And that makes, in my opinion, using it a bit more comfortable, but that's the biggest benefit you're going to get out of it, right? You're not going to suddenly get like a whole bunch better. And a lot of the marketing for mechanical keyboards is largely towards gamers, and it's mostly snake oil. Most of that stuff doesn't have anything to do with it. Marketing for vintage keyboards tends to be, if you actually go and look at it, it tends to be stuff where it's like, oh, well, this one has a bunch of features where you can program stuff into it, right? Or where there's a bank of dip switches in here so that you can set it up to work on an Apple or a PC or a Tandy or a couple different things, right? And they tend to sell themselves on productivity features instead of kind of nebulous gaming features. But man, even some of the old ones will have weird claims on them, where the marketing is clearly just taking everything they can and making a list with it, right? Like I had a box for a board I got online a while ago that said like switch type spring. What does that even mean? Right? Like, you could have just said it did not have switches in it. It was domes. It was just lying to me. But like, it says you still get stuff like that where largely a lot of the marketing is nonsense, right? Modern keyboards will be like, oh, it's got anti-ghosting or whatever. And it's like, yeah, you have to, otherwise it doesn't work at all, right? That's a standard feature in every keyboard. This isn't something special. You're not getting anything cool by getting this one. It's not like there's a board you can get that has ghosting in it. Well, okay, there probably is, but that's going to be like real bargain bin knockoff stuff that wouldn't have that. But I'm not aware of any, right? Or stuff that N key rollover is interesting because the way the USB spec for keyboards works is unclearly defined. So some manufacturers put N key rollover on the hardware, but then when it spits it out to USB, it only pays attention to like 6 keys at most, which is kind of weird. That's not technically to spec, but the spec is unclear, so some manufacturers do it wrong. But also, like, if you're gaming, you only have 5 fingers, right? 6 keys that it can pay attention to simultaneously is fine. It's not as big a feature as you would think, unless you are going absolutely ham, right? Like, unless you're getting into, like, 200 words per minute typing, and, man, I'm lucky if I get, like, 10. So, okay, I can type a bit faster than that, but you get my point there, is a lot of this stuff is marketing. It's not really beneficial to the average consumer, right? Like, if you get to the point where your keyboard is holding you back, you're probably aware enough about what's going on that you don't need to post in, or that you don't need to get on like a keyboard Reddit or in a Discord and be like, hey guys, what's the best keyboard for gaming? Because you probably already have an idea of what specific parts of your kit are messing with you. Also, just have fun. You don't need to be good at it.
So, a few things. One to quickly follow up on before I ask the next question.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to like the ghosting or the rollover, I can actually speak to that one because I experienced that a lot. But then again, this was when the rollover functionality was first being introduced. Some what is it? 2020, like 10 plus years ago now. And where I would come into that kind of issue, and I think this is where it probably spawned off of, not this exact use case, because what have you, but I think due to when it was domed, how the circuits were drawn, depending on what keys you were holding, some of them would cancel out. That's my understanding. So, like, the rollover at that point when it was introduced made perfect sense to advertise it, because it was basically just saying, if you hold Q and E, Q isn't going to cancel out E, and you'll be able to actually, it'll recognize those what have you, right? So I understand what you're saying, and I agree that, in today's climate, or not climate, today's like implementation of it, probably unnecessary. But the thing I am most curious about, because I'm sure you've seen it, and I know the old vintage mechanicals that I would have saw when I was younger in like the computer lab were, everything back then was probably mechanical because it was just easier to have a hard switch set up, right, on an old Apple or a Mac or IBM or whatever. Some of those designs were absolutely wild, and a lot of designs now, unless you're going for reductionist keyboards, where like it's just programming multiple keys to 10 keys to do different things depending on like a function key or what have you. Those aren't what I'm going to be asking about. The wild designs now, typically I've seen, are always in ortho keyboards, ortho mechs, from like places like Kinesis or other companies that are aiming for gentle to incredibly crazy and high level ortho implementations. So my question is, when it comes to wild or buck wild vintage designs versus buck wild like ortho designs now, who do you think did it? Like, who do you think was the most wild? Do you think it's the current implementations, or do you think older buck wild ones were just far crazier?
Ooh. with modern commercial stuff, it's actually not all that different from stuff companies like Maltron have been doing for decades. Which Maltron, a lot of their stuff is ergonomic keyboards, but they also sell a bunch of keyboards that are designed for people with like that have specific disabilities. So they've got like a bunch of one-handed keyboards, for instance, right? I think they sell a keyboard that's designed for people who have to like type by holding a thing in their mouth to type, because they're like in a hospital bed or something. And those ones are really bizarre, but largely because it's not expected that you would use that with two hands the way you would use necessarily like a normal keyboard or, like you said, a Kinesis, right? Where you get into really weird designs is people who like ortho layouts and they like tiny keyboards and they own a 3D printer. Then you get into just the weirdest stuff like you could imagine. You've got stuff where like there is a key where like you like feed your hands into them and there is a key under and above your fingertips, and all sorts of crazy stuff where depending on where it's like bespoke for that person, they designed it themselves. In terms of old stuff, it's really interesting looking at older like Japanese layouts, because they, especially ones that attempt to be ergonomic, because there wasn't ones that predate a sort of like standard Japanese layout. Well, for those, they're based on layouts that aren't standardized, that they further depart from in ways that's really bizarre. I have one of those in a box somewhere that I need to convert, but I would not be able to use it because the layout is buck wild. And then I think the data hand is probably the weirdest vintage one. And that one puts like 5 switches for each finger. And you just kind of like set your hands in it and move your fingers very slightly in a couple different directions to type with it. That one you're supposed to mount, or one of the options for that one is mounting the each hand of the data hands like to your chair so that you can hang your like arms just down from your shoulders kind of loosely and to type that way. Which is such a weird way to do it. Like, most keyboards are designed to sit on a desk usually, so that one it's like, bolt it to your chair. Alright, there you go, you're good. And stenography keyboards are also pretty weird. But largely that stems from trying to do stenography, which is way different from typing alphanumeric characters. There are some folks that use stenography layouts like over USB just as a normal keyboard, which that is going into stuff that I am largely unfamiliar with, because there's, for whatever reason, not a lot of vintage stenography stuff for computers. You get a lot of like mechanical or electrical stenography machines, and then you just kind of, at a certain point, it jumps to just use a laptop and type really fast. They just kind of skip over being like attached to a normal computer for whatever reason.
So, sorry.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I was going to say, so, that's very interesting to bring up, an older companies, or like the data hand, which I encourage anyone to Google it. I'll probably actually throw a picture up on Twitter because absolutely wild. It's a wild keyboard. But no, thank you for your for even discussing those, because I definitely had no idea those existed, and I imagine anyone else who wants to is curious will also be absolutely confused and awestruck by some of something like the data hand. So or like a one-handed keyboard that's intentionally made to be one-handed. So yeah, so thank you for just mentioning those, because that's those are absolutely wild, and crazy to think that they exist.
Oh yeah. I think as far as wacky layouts that I've personally used, I have a like 40% board, ortholinear, so it's all set out in a grid. That I've used. That one's fine. I've done CAD work with it. So like 3D modeling and drafting, and it works fine enough for that. I have a board that I think you would classify as like a 30%. But that one is it's not quite a teletype. That one came from a thrift store where it was donated by like a school for like the people who are hearing impaired. And the point for this one is back before like cell phones and texting were ubiquitous. You would call somebody else with one of these machines. You would both set your handset on the back of this thing, and then you could type back and forth to each other through it. And they've got, I think I have it in this drawer here. It has what, 5 keys that aren't letter keys, right? All of the punctuations are on one of the letter keys. All of the numbers are on a letter key. And you can't. There's no capital and lowercase because the protocol didn't support that. But those are intended for like if people who are, I suppose either they can't hear or they have problems talking. And you largely don't see that anymore. That one is very hard to use because it's like 30 keys. But it's cute looking, like because it's a really tiny board. You still encounter those sometimes at like insurance companies in the US or banks in the US, right? Who still have like older folks that would call in and use those. But like largely speaking, those are entirely obsolete, and those are a really interesting one because there's something that's almost a computer keyboard, right? But it's different so that it looks like you could use it as a computer keyboard, but it's different enough because of its use case that it still ends up being very alien to anybody.
So yeah, yes, I understand what you're saying. That is wild, and very interesting to learn about these things and as they exist, because rarely do you have a reason or what have you to learn about these things, right? Unless like in your case where you like these kind of things, and but thank you, this was interesting to learn about and know that they exist.
Oh yeah.
Now, Roth, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. So, by all means, if, wow, I screwed that up. I want to say, well, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. However, if there's anything else you did want to discuss, a cool game, something, what else you guys are working on, or something you just feel more people should be aware of, the floor is all yours. As well, please let everyone know where they can find more information about you, which I'll also include in the episode description.
Ooh. For the episode, or for more information about me and I guess about Beyond Sunset, we've got a link tree, which I can give you that link to go in the description. So I guess whatever platform folks are listening to, it's down in the thing. As far as that, like I said, I'm on Twitter, I guess, under ZRRION, but I think it's private. I don't know. I don't really use it. Like I'm still on Tumblr, but like, right? Largely, I don't have a huge online presence, to be honest. Other things though that I think people should know about. Let's see. The game Netstorm Islands at War, excellent. I really want somebody to make that. It does not get enough credit for everything, really. It had a weird release where you could hack the demo that they distributed and just get the full game out of the demo files. So that wasn't great. It released right around a handful of other really prominent RTS games. And it was kind of designed for, like, originally it didn't have a campaign at all, and it was designed for online-only play. but like nobody was doing online play by and large for anything other than Doom. So like the infrastructure wasn't there for that. And the campaign that they did put in was kind of lackluster as a result, right? On top of other more prominent games releasing around the same time as it did, and you know, a lot of people just cracking the demo to get the full game. It sold super poorly, but I have not seen another RTS that plays like that, which is effectively PvP tower defense, except it predates tower defense as a genre. And occasionally when I'm working on, well, Beyond Sunset or any other project I'm working on, I will find on YouTube like a multiplayer game, and I will just put that on in the background because the sound of playing that game is burned very deeply into my brain. And largely speaking, nobody knows about it, which is wild to me. Interstate 76 was cool. It runs on the MechWarrior 2 engine, if I remember right, and you're driving cars around and shooting at each other. It has a dedicated button where you get on the CB radio and ask your buddy to just read poetry over the radio. Not enough games have a poetry button. Abalone is neat. It's like chess is the king, and then checkers is in second place, and Abalone... Well, Abalone's not in third place because that'd be backgammon, I guess. But Abalone would be right after backgammon. You push marbles around on a board. The tactile, like the sound it makes when all the marbles move around, and like the feeling of moving everything around is excellent. Definitely recommend people look up that game as far as board games go. What else? Sentinels of the Multiverse is fun. It's a card game where you play as superheroes fighting stuff. And Red Rogue is a really good Flash game, and there's a ton of those that just kind of no one knows about because Flash died forever ago. I think you can download it as a standalone, which is a really excellent roguelike. It's ostensibly a spiritual sequel to the original Rogue. Very good game. I feel like I ought to shout that one out, because with Flash dying, most Flash games have just kind of completely disappeared from everybody's radar. As far as games, though, that's all I've got. Do stuff that's fun.
So, you know, Roth, I'll be sure to include all of that in the episode description for people to follow up on and, you know, follow through on, learn more if they wish. And yes, I agree. Do stuff that's fun. I think that's a wonderful takeaway as a whole for the episode.
Yep.
Now, Roth, if there wasn't anything else, I will let you get on with your day, enjoy your Thursday evening, and relax a little.
Oh, absolutely. It's been very good talking with you.
You know, Roth, I thank you very much. I really appreciated you, you know, making the time for me, and I thank you for the kindness of, you know, I'm glad to hear you enjoyed yourself.
Oh, yeah, not a problem at all. Thanks for having me on.
So thanks again to Roth for making time to have this conversation with me, and thank you for joining us on the Red Tunic podcast. And a special thanks to Ron Jenkins for the use of the music from the title track from Road Steep. And if you like this podcast and want to support and help it grow, please subscribe or follow me on Twitter at Red Tunic Podcast to receive the latest episodes and news, and be sure to share it with those you think might also enjoy it. Thanks. Till next time.